Welcome, and in this exploration, we're going to look at the origin of conflict from the perspective of human consciousness, and we're going to intersect some geometry as a foundation. And everything begins with the circle. We think of the original circle, that little dot of energy less than the size of a pea, out of which our scientists suggest that everything in our known universe has emerged. And the circle is also an interesting juxtaposition, a paradox, if you will, between the one and the infinite, because a circle is both one, but also if you create a circle, it's the one shape that consumes an infinite number of lines. When a computer generates a circle, they create a series of planes or little dots that come together to create a circle. And you can create a circle with an infinite number of dots and lines, the masculine principle, or the one, the feminine principle. And you have perfect symmetry and grace with the circle, which is why we use that shape for wheels and turbines and all kinds of things where energy efficiency and conservation of energy are important. We utilize the sphere. So we start with the sphere. And in mythological terms, this is the garden. This is the ecology. This is the space in which everything is interconnected, but is also unconsciousness. And as we descend from the garden into the knowledge of good and evil, we're descending from the one into polarity, into the distinction between black and white, up and down, male and female, yin and yang, north and south, east and west. We're descending into polarity. And in this descent, which is really a descent into language, because the one has not changed, because we've descended into the knowledge, the consciousness of polarity. The one is the same, as unified as it ever has been. But it's now being perceived through a lens of language. Because until you have a word that says black and a word that says white, which is one of the underpinning problems in racism today, is in either-or thinking. When you divide the one into two, the next step as part of that is this polarity between good and evil, between the left and the right. And of course, the right side, that's the good side, and the left side, that's the bad side. As soon as we take the one and cut it into two with language, because that's all we have, we don't actually take the universe and cut it in two. We don't actually cut the body in two. We do not actually cut the psyche in two. What we do is put an overlay of polarity onto reality that creates the illusion of distinct separation between two poles. And this is the fall from grace. Because before you have language, there's no awareness of up and down, black and white, good and bad, right and wrong. There's no language, so there's no awareness. And so in that ecological whole, every part of the circle is, and it's equal. Every piece of the one is part of the one. The one cannot exist without all of its pieces. You cannot have the one, and delete a single atom, or it ceases to be the one. It's now the one minus a single atom. You cannot have the human race minus one. It's no longer the human race. It's the human race minus one. And so this descent from the grace, and you have grace in the symmetry, in the balance that's part of symmetry. You go to the car shop to have your tires rotated and rebalanced. Why? Because you conserve more energy when you have a balanced wheel. And when you have complete conservation of energy, a state of effortless grace, that's called the garden. And we descend from the garden into the knowledge of good and evil, into the knowledge of distinction. Now, here's where we get into a lot of the cult conflict, because language is what cuts the whole into pieces. We look at this and we say this is a hand. And so you take the hand, and some cultures break it down by finger, and their language is about fingers. And fingers are the unique pointy spaces. Other cultures break it down with space. They say there's the space between here, and the space between here, and the space between there. And these spaces are different. Yes, the hands are part of shaping the space, but you can look at that space and it's different. That's the feminine counterpart, right? Because for any object to exist, it has to have space around it. And you can either delineate the object by defining the space, or you can delineate the space by defining the object. One is emphasizing the masculine, one is emphasizing the feminine. Naturally, in a highly masculine culture such as our own, the focus is on the dot, on the particle. The focus is on the words. You'll never have someone speak in America about the quality of silence. The silence that was after this word was so different and interesting compared to the silence after this other statement. The silence that came after we sang was just so interesting and rich compared to the silence that came after Professor X burped, right? So there can be a focus on the unknown, which is always, of course, so much bigger than the known. But we focus on what do you know? We don't ask what don't you know? And we don't know really how to grapple with a lot of that questions because we're very focused on the masculine side of the equation in the polarity between yin and yang. We're not talking male and female, we're talking yin and yang, masculine and feminine. But every culture is going to break this hand up into different bits. One may break it into curves. One may break it into the angle of the triangle. Like this is a wider triangle, narrower, very narrow, little wider. And so you could break it into angles. You can break it into articulating joints. You can name each finger, or you can name each curve or activity. It just depends on how you want to take the one and break it up. And it's easy to see geometrically because we can take the one and we can break it up like that, but we can just as easily use different language, invent different words or apply them differently and break it up into that. And we could break it up into this, and we could break it into that, and we could break it into any way we want. Because words cut the one into bits. And the finer and more minute the language, the more bits we cut the one into. Now, when you have the undifferentiated whole, there is no conflict. There's no witness that's saying, that algae shouldn't compost those leaves, because that's what happens. The leaves fall to the ground, the algae, the fungi compost the leaves, then the worms eat them and turn them into worm castings. In the undifferentiated ecology, nobody says, quick, stop that worm. It's deteriorating that leaf. It's ruining the shape of that leaf. Stop the worm, quick. We don't say that. But within the knowledge of polarity, the knowledge of good and evil, we define, having cut the world in half, which is the good half and which is the bad half. And then, having determined that, we then consider it our duty, our job, to fight for the right way. Look at that tiger damaging that poor rabbit. Quick, save the rabbit. Stop the tiger. Look at that horrible person pouring pollutants into the river. Stop them. That's bad. That's don't do that. Look at that person hurting that child over there. That's horrible. Stop them. Once we delineate the half of the world that is good and the half of the world that is bad, we create opposition. We create tension. We create a war through language. Because both sides of the possibility field, of the probability field, of the actuality field exist and always have existed, and for all we know, always will exist. The one, the circle, includes east and west, black and white, up and down, north and south, hot and cold. Now, this makes mathematical sense as a possibility field. If you can see 20 miles when you look out of a telescope to the south, if you turn around to the north, as long as there's not an obstruction in the near vision, you'll see 20 miles to the north. And so within a possibility field, there will be equal possibility for sadness and equal possibility for joy. There will be equal possibility for heat and equal possibility for cold. And if we look at it from a human-centric perspective, both of the extremes are toxic. Our body is, 98 degrees or whatever it is. So if we get too hot, if we step into an environment that is 7,000 degrees, it's not very hot. It's not like 2 million degrees, but if we go into 7,000 degree temperature, it's too hot, and we're dead, right? And then we say that's bad because life is good and death is bad. We head into 280,000 degrees below zero. Is there such a thing? Well, it's certainly very cold, and in anything over a few thousand degrees below zero, we're probably dead within a few breaths. And of course, that cold is bad. Why? Because it's too much for us. But is it bad? Is it wrong that somewhere in the universe such coldness exists, or that somewhere in the universe such heat exists? So we're looking at it from the perspective, not only of our own language and our own paradigms through which to shape our language, we're looking at it from the perspective of our existence, our body. Our consciousness is predicated, is based and founded on the ability for our observing and measuring devices to exist, our eyes. So if it's 2,000 degrees below zero and our eyes open up and are instantly frozen, then we lose that observing and measuring device. If it's 2,000 degree heat and we breathe it in and our nostrils are cauterized, and then we lose that observing and measuring device. If the sound is so loud that it shakes and breaks the observing and measuring device of the human ears, then we lose that one. And so if we have no observing and measuring device, then having decided that existence is good and all existence is what the senses can perceive, we then say this is a terrible thing, because it's the opposite of all our senses perceiving stuff. It's all of our senses are fried, are consumed. But a physicist will say that no energy is created or destroyed. It's just endlessly changing form. In other words, the energy that is in our body today is an iteration. If we followed this energy back to the Big Bang, this energy over the last 24 billion years has been many, 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 many things. And for the span of our lifespan, it is what we call our body. But all of the things that it was before, all of the energy that is being organized into the pattern of our body, in order for it to be organized into the pattern of our body, it had to stop being something else. Some of the energy was in our parents, in the process of some from the father, some from the mother, in the process of giving birth. Some of their energy took form and is no longer part of them and is part of us. Is that bad? And what about the carrots and ferns and French fries and all that the energy in our body used to be that, and then it used to be this, and then it used to be that. And before that, it was something else, and before that, it was something else. Before that, it was helium and gases. Now, all of that disappeared in order to become this. And when this disappears, it will become something else. From the perspective of an individual ego in our cult, that's a terrible thing. I don't want all of the energy that I call me to dissipate and become redwood tree if a redwood tree grows over my grave, or become scattered in the water if I'm cremated and scattered in a lake or whatever. So we're looking, as we explore the origin of conflict, at human consciousness and specifically language. Now, one of the things that as we move beyond the simplicity of polarity, black and white, into something a little bit more sophisticated, we're taking the one and we're creating a system through the cult with language. And so we might divide the one like so. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. that's one way to divide the one, to create a rendering of the one, of the undifferentiated ecology within human consciousness. Now, why do we need to create language? Well, all human consciousness is language, because all human consciousness is thought. And you cannot think a thought. I mean, you can think about a feeling and have a consciousness there, but if you cannot put the feeling into language, if you cannot put the sensation into language, then you are not aware of your thought, of your sensation, of your feeling. So we need language to be conscious. Now, here's the problem with a sphere that in truth is more than 1 trillion, 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 trillion dots of energy. If we took just the Earth alone and reduced it to the atomic level, we can't track it, particularly because it takes us so much time with our little consciousness and measuring devices that by the time that we were done counting every atom on the planet, not only would we be dead, but within just moments, everything is changing. Everything is in constant flux. And so it's like we can't create an accurate map of reality because reality is too big for human consciousness to grasp within the paradigm of language. So what we do is we create heuristic models of reality. What we do is we dumb it down. We dumb reality down to a level that we can keep up with in our consciousness using language. And that's why 5 distinctions become useful. We talk about, for example, a common thing in Western culture is work-life balance. Now, for most of the cultures in human history, the 10,000 or more cultures anthropologists know to have existed, each with their own paradigms, mythologies, and language. For most of human history, work-life balance means absolutely nothing. For many people today, it means absolutely nothing. But for those of us for whom it has some meaning, we take the 24-hour clock, we cut it in half, and we say this half is work, and this other half is sleep, relationships, friendships, eating, bathing, investing, vacations. It's all these other things which are, too complicated to enumerate. That's why we use it, right? Because it takes too much time to express reality in complex terms. Of course, it takes vastly more time to do so at the atomic level, but we can't even talk about, the balance between work and brushing our teeth. That's just part of life, right? It's very vague. It's very obtuse and simple relative to reality. And so what we do is, whether it's a very crude model like work-life balance, or let's say we do a little bit more of a sophisticated model, right? Like, we have Stephen Covey and his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And what Stephen does is he'll break behavior down into these 4 quadrants. And one quadrant is important things, and the other quadrant is not important. And the other quadrant is urgent things, and the other quadrant is not urgent. And so you can have highly urgent things that are not important and highly urgent things that are important. And you can have unimportant things that are not urgent. You can have important things that are not urgent. And so this is just another system for cutting the one into parts. And so if we look through, the last 100 years of self-help, for example, what you'll find is that the undifferentiated whole, the complexity of life, is being tackled. Consciousness is assailing it with systems that refract the one into parts that seem to be useful. Whether they are or not, they seem to be useful. And so 7 Habits of Highly Effective People was a major bestseller. And the quadrants of, the 4 quadrants and the emphasis on focusing on highly important things that are not urgent as the big distinguisher between highly effective people and ineffective people. That's a little remnant that, even though Stephen is now dead, remains and is a piece of technology. It's a piece of language that is in use today. And all language, like all the plants and all the animals in human history, is a pattern of energy. And given that language generates human consciousness, it is a pattern of consciousness. And in the constructs of consciousness through language, there is a tension, just like the tension between the gazelles and the tigers. Because all systems are at war with one another. All cults are at war with one another. All identities are at war with one another at some level. Now, there are counterpart identities that complement and fit well together, but in terms of the models, particularly if you think of cult models, the American cult and the French cult, there's a distinction. We eat this. Well, we eat this. We talk and cut the world up with these symbols. Well, we cut the world up with these symbols. We think this is the way to do things. Well, we think this is the way to do things, right? So you have a tension. And all cults throughout human history have been seeking recruits. In the Philippines, where I've spent some time, the Catholic Church is passionate. The Catholic Church invaded with the Spanish conquests, the native Filipino peoples, and has been adamant, long after America is using condoms and birth control, long after the Italians and the Spanish are using condoms and birth control. The Catholic Church is hanging on to the Philippines for dear life. No birth control. And one of the ways they do this is you have to get a prescription for birth control. And they price the prescription at a rate that almost no one can get it in a poor country. And so, and you can imagine the tremendous suffering that occurs with being encouraged to go forth and multiply when you cannot even afford birth control. It is a terror of childhood abuse. Just the anecdotal evidence that I experienced and heard about was horrifying. And yet, the Catholic Church is hanging on to its identity in tension with the Muslim identity, because the Muslims are taking over. Their identity, their cult, is growing faster than the Catholic cult. So even though children are being damaged in this, we can't lose our identity, And so when you have a structure, when you have a meme, when you have a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, there's a certain part of human consciousness that says, that's me. And it's a bad thing if I don't exist. So I want to exist, and I want to exist past me. Like I want my children to copy and do what I did. The father that wants their child to carry on the family farm, etc., their legacy. It's about identity. I want my identity to go forward. So when you have an I inside identity, a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, there's attachment. That's me and that's not me, and I'm good and that's bad, right? Because we've cut the world in half. So what is me is good, what isn't me is bad. So I want to reward what is me and discourage and attack and, kill and blame, etc., what is not me, i.e., what is bad. And in case we haven't noticed, just about every cult of the 10,000 cults in human history and counting assure their people with great sincerity and, do it our way. This is the only way to do it. This is the way we are. This is who we are, and that's why you have to do it our way. And it's not a very strong argument. If you're an unhappy child in a dysfunctional cult, who cares that this is the way we do it? I'm suffering. I want to do it the way they are. But the parents, the cult leaders, always trying to control and pull people back into doing it their way. And people, when they come in and say, what about this and what about that and what about change and this? No, we can't change the cult. This is our tradition. And so there's a great attachment to identity, to the pattern that is the status quo. And a lot of this ties in psychologically with the fear of the unknown, which ties in with the fear of death, which ties in with the fear of being out of control, which ties in with the fear of re-traumatization. Because in a dysfunctional cult, every single one of the cult members have been repeatedly traumatized, either directly, meaning they experience the trauma, but through mirror neurons in the brain. If you are in a cult, and let's say you're the king and you were born into royalty, right? You were born into luxury, and so you haven't been jilted. You haven't had your home seized by the king because you're the king's son. But you're not dumb. You've watched your father, the king, ruin this peasant's life, rape this woman, do this. You've watched what could happen if you didn't have power. So naturally, you are terrified of being out of control, because if you're out of control, you might lose the power. And if you lost the power, it would go to someone else. And if it went to someone else, then they could do to you what you saw Dad do to them. It's terrifying. I don't want to ever be out of control. Well, how do you stop being out of control? You got to stay in known territory. I don't want anything to change. Because if it changed, I'd be out of control. And if I lost control, who knows what could happen? That most horrible thing that I dread and fear could happen. And my loyalty is to making sure that it doesn't happen. I'll do anything to make sure that horror of horror does not happen. And for a start, I'll get as much control and as much power as possible, so that I can make sure that things don't change and that this doesn't happen and this doesn't happen. Because I'm so afraid of feeling all that pain that I watched happen to another person. In an incompetent cult, there is tremendous unnecessary trauma and chronic suffering. And whether you feel it directly or whether you feel it empathically, by understanding that you are in a game of musical chairs, where when the music stops, there are going to be a certain number of people who are left without a home, who are left without a job, who are left without a raise, who are left without medical insurance, who are left without a partner, who have no one to love and no one to love them. The cult produces them every day. You look around and you realize that could be me. I'm terrified that that could be me. So I've got to have control. So I've got to keep it safe. So I've got to stay in known terrain. So I've got to stop change. And now my identity, as mediocre, as absurd, because if you think about an identity, a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being in human consciousness, framed in language, if you think about identity, it's not all that appealing in most cases. I mean, every single pattern could be iterated and improved. The one that cannot, the sphere, is outside our frame. We cannot live a symmetrical, spherical life beyond the knowledge of good and evil, because our consciousness cannot refract infinity. It can only make a very crude, dumbed-down version. And truly so, if we want to return to the goddess, to the god, to the all that is, to the ecology, to the transcendent realm beyond the knowledge of good and evil, the very first thing we have to do is surrender our pattern, our distinct pattern that says this is me and that's not me. You can't return to the garden while clinging too tightly to identity. Now, language creates a system, creates a model of reality that is not reality, it is a model of reality. And what's more, all language, all systems are an imperfect model of reality. And the way to look at this is, if you took a sphere here and you cut it in half, well now, and then you discard the other half. That's the illusion, right? That if we could just get rid of the bad people, the bad stuff, the bad energy, then everything would be wonderful. But of course, we don't do that with our cars, do we? Because we could actually cut our tires in half and have an incredibly bumpy ride. Because, what would it feel like to have the axle here and be very smooth as we're going around, and then boom, and then flatten the ground. Then we have to really rev the engine to get it up off. Could we, smoke peeling and all that. And we go around one rev, and then we'd fall flat in our faces again. It would be the most violent ride imaginable. So we don't actually do it because it doesn't work, but we do it in the delusion of human consciousness. We fantasize. We could only get rid of Republicans, right, or lawyers, right, or the left-wing extremists. Let's just get rid of them. We pretend that the one would function better if you could cut the world in half and throw half of it away. But we don't actually do it when it comes to our car tires, etc., because it's so painful. We don't actually, although most of us have the candor to admit that having broken the world into two, and this is the good part and this is the bad part, most of us are not quite as blind as to allow us to pretend that none of what we call bad is inside. If we call hate bad and love good, that's one way to split the world into two. Well, there's, of course, a continuum from irritation to annoyance to anger to, helplessness and all this stuff and, hate at the end. So you've never been annoyed, So if we do cut the world into half, we also cut ourself into half. But most of us don't actually carry through with, I want to get the bad stuff out of me. So there's just the good stuff left, right? Well, of course, the practical extreme would be just to cut your body in half and throw the other half away. But we know that doesn't work. And so we don't do it really. But we pretend that we'd like to do it psychologically, emotionally, mentally. If I could just take half of my thoughts and get them away, right? Because the circle is an interconnected ecology. So this would be a very bumpy ride. Now, it would be perhaps a little bit more comfortable if rather than cutting our wheel in half and driving around, we did a triangle. Be a little bit more comfortable, but still rather bumpy. And it'd be less bumpy if we did squares. And it would be even less bumpy if we did an 8-sided angle. If we're going to drive on angular shapes, the more points going out, the softer the ride. Now, systems and language create conflict with the attachment to identity. That's one form of conflict. The other form of conflict is if you're in this system and I'm in this system over here, or if you're in this system, you're using these sets of filters, and I'm using this set of filters over here. We can't mentally get close to one another, particularly if there's an attachment to identity. And there's this great fear within the traumatized culture of losing oneself. And what we mean is that our pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being would dissipate, would be lost, and instead we would find ourselves, horror of horror, in somebody else's pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And we will have lost ourselves and in the other, right? We've lost ourselves in the other. Now, to a traumatized person, this is the worst outcome imaginable. It means you can't retain your own identity. And of course, this is every child's reality. They come into the world one way and the cult starts hammering on them, do this, don't do that, do this, cuts everything they're doing into two. And, pretty soon, many of them feel, completely worthless. And, oh my goodness, I go, oh, please, what's wrong with playing in the dirt? Well, cleanliness is next to godliness. Dirt, that's dirty. And? Well, we've decided that dirty is a slur. Well, why? How did you come up with that? Mom? You didn't notice that all life comes from dirt? Everything you eat grows in dirt? I mean, what's so wrong about dirt? Would you really think, don't ask questions, just do what you're told, or we'll hit you, or won't give you any dessert. And so you lose your sanity piece by piece. You lose your identity, and you fall into the identity of the other. Now, given that every pattern of energy, every pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being generates a probability field, number one, that in a given ecology, number two, in a given environment, creates a statistical outcome, number three, for things like suicide, like obesity, like baldness, like fatigue, meaning a certain, pattern A of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being will create more or less chronic fatigue than pattern B of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. Pattern A of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being will create more or less depression than pattern B. Will create more or less obesity, heaviness that does not facilitate movement and lifespan. Will create more or less creativity. Will create more or less wealth, however you define that. Will create more or less sex. Will create more or less physical symmetry, otherwise known as beauty. Will create more or less sustainability, otherwise known as the size of the landfill and the amount of stuff that we turn into, that we turn nature into all these things that we don't know what to do with, and so we call it garbage, rather than say this is the stuff we don't know what to do with, that we made. We just label it, that way we don't highlight our inadequacy. In a shame-based cult, which is one pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, we punish people for not knowing and making mistakes. And so if we say, this whole pile, like an American will generate 100 tons of stuff in their lifetime that they don't know what to do with. And so they call it garbage. So at the end of an American's life, there's this huge pile of 100 tons of stuff that they don't know what to do with, that they don't want. They wanted it before, but they don't want it now, and they don't know what to do with it. Now, in a shame-based cult where you get punished for not knowing what to do and making mistakes, it's not good to say that must be something wrong with me. I don't know what to do with all this stuff that I've created. So then we say, well, no, there's nothing wrong with me. That is garbage. It's flawed. I'm not flawed. It's flawed. So if you're going to punish someone or blame someone, blame the cardboard, blame that old stereo. It should have worked longer, but it didn't. And so, Panasonic isn't what it used to be. Blame anything but me, because in a shame-based cult, anyone who makes a mistake is going to be punished. And so the key thing is to make sure that if there are any mistakes, that they're over there, somewhere else gets punished, says the good sociopath. And so the competent sociopath is going to make sure that everyone else gets more pain than they do through any means necessary. So there's going to be a tension between two identities, two shapes. And the question is, should you hold on to your identity at all cost, or should you do the intelligent thing, which is to consider, okay, they eat grasshoppers. They talk and make these weird sounds. I talk, of course, intelligently in English, but they're making all these weird sounds, speaking Cantonese or whatever it is, and so there's a shift. Now, an intelligent person says, what if I did lose myself in the identity of this family? I'm lonely, I'm isolated, I have chronic fatigue, I feel depressed, I feel dissatisfied with my job, I don't like the way women are treating me. I don't like this. I hate driving in this road, So that's my identity. I'm thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being these things. And, it's very dissatisfying. But I wouldn't want to give that up, right? And join a playful, fun, interesting family of multi-generations living together that 2 or 3 adults are taking care of every child. I wouldn't want to lose my identity and be happy. And so what I'm getting to is, if you are in tension, if you travel around the world, leaving your cult and observing that these people are creating more sustainable well-being per unit of energy consumed than you are and most of your cult is, by all means, don't feel duty-bound to hang on too hard to your suffering. By all means, lose your identity and adopt another identity that is more intelligent, objectively, that creates more sustainable well-being per unit of energy consumed, mentally, emotionally, physically. So do it. Lose your identity. But of course, you'd have to lose some of your control. You'd have to face some of your fear of the unknown. And so that's, the counter. And that might feel very uncomfortable if you're a traumatic survivor, because every abused child says the same thing. I'm never going to let anyone do this to me again. There's only one way to do it, and that's to keep control and distrust and barriers between every other person for the rest of your life. So every identity creates a statistical probability field in every area that you measure. Weight, color sensitivity, empathy, anything you measure will be a little or a lot different emerging out of an identity, out of a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And this is how cult identities and personal identities evolve. As a general rule, people are moving towards more intelligent identities that consume less energy and yield more sustainable well-being, with a little bit of wrong turns around the sides, because we have body and brain hacking. If we just drink enough Coke and watch enough Netflix and YouTube, our body will say we're getting somewhere for a while, until we go numb and lose our sleep routine and wake up with an extra 100 pounds of sugar and wonder how we got there, being promised by our body with every little dopamine hit and every little adrenaline hit, promised by our body that we were living the good life, we were heading somewhere good. But I feel worse every year, living the good life hour by hour, minute by minute. And so at some point, there's then a backlash with that, with what is a hoax identity. YouTube figured out how to make billions, addicting you to its videos. It didn't figure out how to give you a more meaningful life. It figured out how to make billions selling advertisements with clickbait. And at some point, people wake up and say, YouTube, you lied to me. You convinced my body with these thumbnails that this was a really important thing to do with my time. Now I'm divorced, I have no kids, I'm fat, and I'm lazy because I've atrophied. And you promised me every step of the way. My body, you tricked my body into saying just one more video. So at some point there's a backlash, and pretty soon YouTube won't be able to make billions addicting people, because once the data catches up with reality, with awareness, and people have the statistics, for every video you click, you will gain X ounces and this and this and this. Well, then once that becomes, then they'll figure out some new way to make a quick buck, because that's what reptilian brains do. The scarcity brain, the fear brain, trying to get more for less. Now, the tensions of identity clash. This is usually where we get war, because, of course, if Hitler would have had a difficult time going to war with the world if everyone around the world just adopted the German identity. Everywhere Hitler went, people said, Heil Hitler. He'd probably be in such a good mood, he might even give up on some of his racism. It's kind of, it's kind of hard to have endless contempt for your supporters, your base, your power base. I'm sure we have enough sociopaths to figure it out, but obviously there's going to be less war if the invader comes in and says everyone has to do it like this, and sure, we'll do it like that. But that may not be satisfying, because the ego, the differentiator, how do I know that I'm me? How do I know that I'm me and I'm not you? How do I hang on to my meanness if you're all like me? And so then you have to start fighting with people you actually agree with, just to fight. To find something to argue with. And the ego is terrified of losing its meanness and blending into the whole, becoming part of the one. Because as soon as you become part of the one, you no longer exist as an ego. It's very difficult to say that you're more important or less important, two of the ego's favorite games, if you're interconnected and nobody's measuring. So the ego doesn't want to go back, to the one and stuff, and so has to say, I'm better than that, and I'm less than that, but I'm different. I'm me. And yet we have, of course, the tension of loneliness, because I feel so alone and so separate. But don't get near me. Don't. I might lose my identity, and I might get lost in the relationship. Heaven forbid. And of course, the intelligent relationships and cults and identities to get lost in are those that are less depressing, more creative, more loving, more life-affirming, more enthusiastic, more successful, more profitable, more abundant, more pleasure-filled sustainably than your identity. Go find them and get lost in them. Discover a new identity. And then your ego can hang on and defend that and for dear life. So there's the tension of just wanting to know and be known. And so I want you to think the way I do, so that when I'm excited about something, you'll agree with me. That's what I want. But there's another important aspect of conflict and war, if you will, that occurs with every system. Because every system is defined with distinction and boundaries. So think of the system of employment. So as soon as I say that we are a culture that values cleanliness, so then we don't value dirtiness, right? Okay. So then how do we can't just be crazy and schizophrenic, right? So now we have to have less dirt in our factories, in our offices, we can't have dirty clothes on people coming into the office. So you must now dress presentably with our clean culture. So we've taken the one, we've divided it into two, and we've said, you have to be you have to be on this side. You have to be clean and no dirt. Now, of course, there is no perfect distinction. One, it's a grayscale, and two, everything is interconnected ultimately. And so it becomes the relative. She's more clean than she is. She has a more, and then we say we're a cheerful company, where you have a positive mental attitude, and she's always cheerful, and you're pointing out, you're being negative, right? And so in order to create a cult, you have to divide the cult into distinctions. You then pick the things that are the good distinctions, and you try and get rid of the things that are the bad distinctions. And then you have to create a boundary, because if you just say we're this way, it doesn't work. So you have to fire the people who are dirty, who don't come in with clean clothes. You have to fire them. You have to fire the people who have negative attitudes, and you have to reward the people who are the most positive. They have to get raises, so now we're creating a boundary between those that are inside the system, the good people, and those that are outside of the system, the bad people. However, every time, first of all, every system creates a remainder. It creates people that are outside of it that don't fit the mold. And whether it's, if we go back to these two systems, the 5 and the 6-pointed, structure here, like in this system, these people here are outside the boundary, and these people here are outside the boundary. And if we look at this, if we say that all these people are inside the boundary and all the people outside are the remainder, let's say it's about 30%, let's say it's 25% remainder. So there's 25% of the people don't fit within the system. That is, as it's defining itself. But they are, in fact, an integral part of the system. You cannot, delete parts of an ecology and still have it work. You can't just take out your liver and still have your nose. If the body dies, your nose dies with it. So, at some point, if you unravel the thread and try and delete this and delete that and delete this, you'll find that you're deleting everything. If you delete half of the world, you delete the other half, because one polarity cannot exist without the other. The North cannot exist without the South. It has no meaning. If there is no South, there is no North. White cannot exist without black. There's no reference point. So language is about cutting things up. Now, the same is true with your positive system. Like, if everyone's positive, if every single person on the planet is positive and competent and all that, you can't be the best company. You can't have really positive people unless there are other negative people to compare, to make the comparison. So they're necessary parts of the system, even if the role that they play is to be villainized or scapegoated in a certain way. But one of the big tensions and wars that happen is all human beings are afraid of loneliness. They're afraid of exclusion. They're afraid of being deranked, considered inferior. And so what happens psychologically is that as soon as you create a system that says we only like positive people and these are the positive people, then the negative people who get fired or don't get the position, etc., resent the positive people, the people that got hired. And so there's a sabotage and a destruction that takes place at some level. Whether it's just being aware, like if you're a higher up person and you're in a cult that is surrounded in poverty and corruption and there's a lot of resentment towards people who are wealthy, well, you can join the wealth cult, but you then have to be aware of the psychic field of hostility. There's a whole bunch of people that would like you to fail. And the empathic and mirror neurons of the brain, there's some part of you that wants to please them, to fail so that they'll be happy. So if that's the polarity, then you've got a large group of people that are undermining the system of those people at the top. when you have someone at the top of a power pyramid, in a power pyramid, there's one person at the top that has the most power. Well, when power is valued and powerlessness is shamed, then everyone's competing. So you could be up at the top, but in order to do that, you are being gunned at from every direction. So what I'm getting at is that every system creates distinctions, and every distinction creates an in-group and an out-group. And the more severe the disparity of well-being between the in-group and the out-group, the more the out-group will seek to undermine the system that generates their disparity. And so the antithesis of a system, the saboteurs of the system, are the people within and the people without that aren't happy. Now, the same happens psychologically within the people in the system. Like, if my boss demands perfect dress code, there's a part of me that doesn't resonate with that. There's a part of me that is the lazy casual dresser. But if the boss says you'll be fired if you dress lazily and casually, then within my power structure, a part of me says, no, lazy casual dresser, you can't show up at work. And the lazy casual dresser says, why? I don't like this job. I hate this job. There's no room for me at this job. Now, that lazy casual dresser in me can't wait for me to get fired. Wants to undermine every possible way so that I'll get fired, because then I'll be able to lay around in sweatpants and dribble food on the sofa as I'm watching my favorite thing. We'll just get to veg out in front of Netflix and eat various things and spit, and nobody will complain, and it'll feel great. And that's what one part of me wants. And the only way he's going to get what he wants is if he gets me to lose my job. So there's an inner conflict that's created with these boundaries and distinctions. The part that resents having to live up to the standard and celebrates the collapse of the structure that imposes the standard. Then there's another part of me that says, no, this is great. This is how we advance. This is our way we're going to have our future and well-being. And so every system that creates these polarities creates an in-group and an out-group on the outside and an in-group and an out-group on the inside. And the out-group is always trying to sabotage and undermine the group that excludes them, that doesn't welcome them in. And this is one reason that utopian adventures or aspirations almost always have within them profound dystopian, counter things. You've never seen two people fight as dirtily as two extreme idealists trying to, create the perfect vision. And boy, do they hate each other. That wasn't the perfect vision. We were going to do it this way and this way. And so this is always very, very funny because idealists, myself included, are always such a pain in the butt in some ways. So it's absolutely wonderful. It's heaven for the lazy parts of the psyche to watch two idealists, wear themselves out and fume off in a huff. Just now that the rest of the group can do whatever they felt like and be lazy. But this is how a system with any distinctions creates conflict. You divide the whole into pieces, and the first conflict is between the good pieces and the bad pieces. The second conflict is different people define the good pieces and the bad pieces differently, and so then you have a second conflict between my good pieces are really good and your good pieces aren't good, and my bad pieces are bad and your bad pieces are good, and so then you have the second conflict. Then you have the third conflict, which is the conflict between the excluded people, the people that fit into the system and the don't, because if you do all the things to be a dutiful Catholic, okay, you fit in the system, but your sister, oh, she's going to hell, Did you see, she didn't go to communion. You saw her hanging around that boy, having pleasure, heaven forbid. And so now you've split the family, right? You've got the good people that are in the system who now have to separate from the bad people. So this is the third, the third conflict. And then the fourth conflict is all the parts of you that don't want to be in the box that the majority of you voted for, the rebels within the psyche that can't stand, the idea of being caught in this spiritual goody two-shoes perfectionist box, whatever it is, and just resent and the idea that you think you're better than me, and you did all these things and this, so you're so superior. I wouldn't have asked, licked, and done that. I would have just, told the teacher to fuck off. And, you swore, oh my goodness, I would never swear. I'm too spiritual. Well, fuck yourself. All of these different parts. Well, then you've got the fourth battle. And then the fifth battle comes now that you're entrenched in 5 different battles. The fifth battle then becomes grace, life. It's hard to maintain a system. Whatever the system is, it's bumpy relative to the grace of the sphere, relative to the ecology of the garden. It's hard to keep a system. Why? Because every system is flawed. Every system is flawed. Now, you can think of that flaw if you imagine this circle here as a wheel. Now, if you're on the point here on your wheel and you're going from one side to the other, there's a point that's smooth, right? You're on the point. But as soon as you hit the flat part and bang, it's painful, right? Or you could think of driving, right, around this circle. So you're driving here. It's nice and flat. It's easy. But then you get to this sharp curve. And it's a bit of an angular. Those transitions, those angular transitions, they just don't feel good. So now you've got the new conflict because every time you operate a system, whatever it is, you have part of the system that works well, and then you get to these transit points in the system, and it doesn't feel good. I know I said I wanted to be a Catholic, and I know I said I wanted to be a Buddhist. I know I said that I was going to be an environmentalist. But we can't have a single plastic bag. I have to hold all these things. I forgot the plastic bag. I have to drive home in my electric car to get one plastic bag. I mean, oh gosh, it's like, oh my goodness. It's so annoying. If I could just be free of this system. Just go with the flow. But the ego says, no, this is our system. That's not who we are. We're not those people, the bad people, right? We're the good people. So now you have the final fight. The part that wants to blend and just give up the fight. Come on, please, please. Do we have to talk? About everything wrong with my political party. Again. You have your list, right? Yeah. Do we have to do that again? Could we just relax into the garden? Could we just enjoy the moment beyond thought. And the ego says, no, this is important. This is the point where the wimps, the wimps give in, right? The real feminists don't just let someone hold the door. That's just the beginning. You just wait. Just after they hold the door for you, then they'll be looking at you as this condescending, weak person. Toughen up, girl. Hold your boxes and use your back. It's like, we just not have another discussion about the righteous cause. And the radical says, no, this is who we are. So now you have a civil war. That's the 5th battle. Well, you have a 6th battle. Because you're busy doing your civil war, and this is the right way, And then you have the transcendent brain, the divine, calling you home, calling you back. Please, let it go. Let it go. Come back into the garden. The ego says, I don't want to die. I don't want to lose control. I don't want to let it go. Okay, says the garden, says God, Goddess, all that is. Okay, hang on to your identity a little bit more. And the identity then says, but I feel so lonely. I feel so separate. Why does no one understand me? Because you're different. That's your whole stick. You're the one doing this and this and this, and they're the people doing that. So of course they don't understand you. You're different. Come back to the garden. No. Why doesn't anyone understand me? Why doesn't... You've got another battle. So all of this begins with descending from the one, from the sphere, from the garden, from the divine feminine, the unity of all that is, into the polarity of the masculine, the distinction, the language, the awareness. It all emerges. All the conflict emerges. And of course, within the cult of language and paradigm, conflict is bad, says the New Age healer. Just have to get rid of conflict. You had a conflict there, but you flowed over here, right? So now we have a new conflict, right? You were the good people over here. Now you're the bad people again. You couldn't use that. And so it's these endless loops round and round. So these are the basis for all conflict. And all conflict along these lines will exist to some degree as long as there is egoic consciousness, human consciousness, which is predicated on language, which is a knife. Language is a knife that cuts the world into bits. And depending on how it's cut and then how it's put back together again, then you can argue about which is the good way and the bad way to do it. 10x living is, of course, the good way to do it. And 1x living, that's the bad way. And so you have to work hard to analyze things, and don't just think, moderate improvement is good enough. You have to do a 10x improvement and this and that, and this is the cool way to do it. You can be in this group if you will do these things. You'll be out of this group if you don't do this and don't do that. Now we have to police the borders, right? This is the good bit and that's the bad bit. This is the paradox of systems. All human consciousness arises from systems, the system of language to begin with. All suffering emerges out of human consciousness. I mean, not only do humans suffer a lot more than most of life, but humans cause a tremendous amount of the asymmetries on the planet. And yet, within the paradigm of systems, there will always be waste, there will always be imperfection, but there is a journey of going from less perfect to more perfect. And the reference point is the sphere. So we start with this, and we delete that and go to this. We delete that and go to this. Delete that. Go to this. We go to this. We keep creating distinctions. And after a time, if we do so symmetrically with balance, responding, after a time, we create so many symmetrical distinctions in a complex synergy of relationships that eventually the one returns. The unconscious one becomes the return to know that which we left unconsciously for the first time. And the reward, the gift, so to speak, is to be able to appreciate through conscious eyes every single nuance of reality, of all that is. To have the innocence of not knowing and the wonder of knowing, the innocence of the child and the wisdom of the old man, of the old woman, as two faces of wonder, as two faces of the divine. And this is the human journey, out of the garden, unconsciously, returning to the garden consciously and knowing it for the first time. I've had a lot of fun exploring these ideas with you, and I hope they've been enjoyable for you as well. Hi, I'm Dane Rose. All knowledge begins with a paradigm, and out of that paradigm comes an idea, an awareness that we adopt, reject, or synthesize into something better. It doesn't become wisdom, it doesn't become useful until we take action, until we integrate it into not only our thoughts, but our feelings, our body, our words, and our way of being. For that to occur, we have to move from the passive media paradigm into more active engagement. In the link below, in the More Information section, is an invitation to join a very small, deliberately filtered, high-quality discussion with a group of people who share a common language and want to work with these ideas, with me and with one another, with the sole goal of creating 10 times more sustainable well-being for ourselves and those around us per unit of energy invested. Thank you for watching.